the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back. A couple of weeks ago, we did a show with a young writer, John Ganz, When the Clock Broke, Con Men, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 90s. But John is prolific, not only writing books, but very interesting articles. And the latest one is in this month's issue of one of my favorite monthly magazines, Harper's The Dead Admonish, Facing the Ghosts of Resistance and Exile. It's about John's return as such to Cologne. It's got nothing to do with the America of the 90s. John is joining us from the Upper East Side in New York City. John, tell us the story of this piece. It's an exceptionally interesting piece written by an American Jew returning to the Germany where his family originated.
So basically, several years ago, I was alerted by a friend of mine, an old professor from college, that I had a relative who perished in the Holocaust by the name of Gottfried Ballin, and his mother did too. Her maiden name was Ganz, Anna Ganz. She would have been my grandfather's aunt, so he would have been a cousin of mine. And he worked, at the family bookstore in Cologne. We owned a bookstore for a few generations, 2 generations to be precise, in Cologne, which was a very big and famous bookstore in the area. Of course, they had to give it up during the Nazi period. And Gottfried joined a socialist resistance movement in Germany at the time. It was a small group, a cell essentially. They didn't get much done before they were all arrested. Gottfried was in prison, charged with treason at a very young age. I think he was 20 when he was sent to prison. He was charged with treason. This is 1934. He writes prolifically from prison to his mother and his fiancée, a woman that he met in the resistance cell. And after learning about his existence or his past, which my grandfather didn't talk at all about, we discovered that these letters were collected. So I began the slow process of researching this history.
The piece suggests, and please correct me, John, if I'm wrong, that you
Sure.
went in thinking that your family had escaped the Nazis, that you weren't, that you'd had a great deal of luck, in fact, because of course a lot of this depends on luck. And then you found that the family wasn't quite so lucky. How did that change your view of your family?
It's difficult to say. I think there was a hesitation to speak, obviously, of those who had been lost and maybe a sense of survivor's guilt. I did not grow up, perhaps as good, with a strong sense of victimization. I thought we had sort of gotten off scot-free, and my grandfather sort of gave us that impression. The sense of loss, I suppose, I think was accentuated by this. And also when it was someone who was so extraordinary in a way, extraordinarily brave. It was strange to me that he was somewhat of a hero, but my family was very hesitant to talk about him. He never met my grandfather, who I knew, but also just never mentioned him to my father. And also, I think there was a certain amount of pride in the family because we're bookish sorts. of having owned a bookstore in Cologne, but I wasn't so aware of what that represented to the family. And as I went back into these letters and memoirs, the pain of that loss and dispossession, I think, became a little clearer to me. We've been fortunate and have started new lives in the new world. But there's been some desire, I suppose, to leave that old world behind. And I can begin to understand that more when you face exactly what's been lost and how dire that is.
You arrived or you appear to arrive in Cologne, John, defiant. You arrived, and this is how the piece begins. I arrived at the Jewish cemetery in Cologne on Yom Kippur. It was late September last year. I'd not fasted. I never do. It's the most defiant Jew, the holiest day of the year. Proud of the fact that you didn't fast. Did this experience of finding that there were figures in your family who had been killed by the Nazis, did it change your view of what it means personally to be a Jew? There seems to be, you don't come out explicitly, but I get a sense that there's something brewing there in this piece.
I have always considered myself a Jew and almost a religious one, even though I'm not observant in a traditional way. And I think that my sense of a belief in God was definitely heightened by this. I believe that Gottfried and his kind of anti-fascist socialism, and my family with their bookstore and their worship of art and culture, which was common among German Jews, to me are just as representative of Jewishness and have a connection to a certain kind of spiritual conception of the world as following Halakha. So to me, yeah, I suppose it's always been there. It was an intense reconnection with that, but I sort of, I mean, on the one hand, it heightened my religious sensibilities, but I also believe that there was something intrinsically kind of Jewish and spiritual about the secular pursuits of my family, both in terms of culture and in terms of politics.
You're also the author, as I mentioned earlier. We did an excellent show a couple of weeks ago on this, When the Clock Broke, about the early 90s. You focus in part, certainly at the beginning of the book, on the role of David Duke, an explicit, not just anti-Semite, but neo-Nazi, someone who celebrated the destruction of European Jewry. How relevant was this trip in terms of what's happening now in When the Clock Broke? You draw at least a dotted line between what happened in the early 90s and what's happening in the 2020s with Donald Trump and the Republican Party.
I mean, the background of my politics and my engagement in politics is obviously my family's experience in the war and the time before the war. I mean, this informs my anti-fascism. So yeah, it is. There's a direct connection between the two of them. I mean, one is sort of the core commitments that I believe I have or try to keep, and the other is the kind of practical work that I do. I'm also a historian. I don't think everything I do is pure political practice. I hope that I can tell stories objectively and with some fidelity to the truth. But absolutely, the learning that I had a relative who sort of died for his ideals and fighting the Nazi regime certainly made me take my vocation much more seriously. Let's put it that way.
It's history, in a sense. Did you get a sense, John, that history is repeating itself? When you were in Cologne, Masha Gessen, the New Yorker writer who had won the Arendt Prize, wasn't allowed to get it because of her remarks about Israel. Is history, in a sense, do you fear it's repeating itself?
I think, unfortunately, all Jews live with the sense that history repeats itself. And it does to a certain extent. There's a certain amount of rhyming that we have to pay attention
Marx,
to.
of course, who was from a very distinguished Jewish family, had the great remark about
Right.
history repeating itself, first as tragedy and then as farce.
Right. I think that is certainly part of the Jewish experience. I also believe it can be a limiting horizon about how to interpret the present and even the past, which is that some things are different, some things do change. History has new horizons and new possibilities. So the careful attendance to the meaning of the past is obviously important, but it can also blind one about the significance of new events in the present. I hope that I don't fall victim to that, but I'm sure that I do. I'm sure there are things about the present that I am too quick to analogize to the past and that are radically new. But I think that this is obviously we also must interpret the past and learn its lessons so far as you can. But it's always a fine line between recognizing what is truly new in a situation and what we can find roots of in earlier times.
John, one of the another John has been on the show several times. John Kampfner, Anglo-Jewish journalist, wrote an interesting book about Germany, suggesting that it is the most civilized place in the world. I think he at one point, or has he taken up German citizenship? He hasn't given up his British citizenship, but as a Jew, he embraces Germany now. Your piece in Harper's addresses the nature. I mean, it's anecdotal, so it's not an analytical piece, but anecdotally addresses what Germany is like today. You go into the bookstore that your family used to own. You tell them that you're quoting, my family used to own this store. I'm sure it didn't make you particularly popular. Did you get any sense that Germany has really begun, perhaps in contrast to America, an entirely new chapter, a blank page in its history?
I think it's extremely haunted by its history and doesn't know what quite to do with it. And I don't blame them entirely, but it's not a comfortable, for me as a Jew, it was not an entirely comfortable place to be. Not that people didn't mean well, but often their meaning well was irksome or condescending or strange in its own way. I'm also an American and feel very comfortable in the United States. So I did not view, I've always had a kind of worshipful attitude towards German culture as highly sophisticated and civilized, with this business about Goethe and Hegel and Beethoven and all this, and I still have that. But I definitely did not feel at home in Germany or felt any desire to take up residence there. I am very happy to live in the United States. I think this is a cosmopolitan place where you can have many different stories from your background and have them kind of all mixed together. And that's great. I found that the homogenous nature of Germany, although there are many immigrants there, to be strange. And I found Germans' attitudes to be incomprehensible. Yeah, I am not a German. That's basically what I would say. I just did not have a sense that I understood the people there, or that they understood me, or it was these were my people in any way. I felt like an alien, or as sometimes I said in the piece, a ghost, and it was an alienating experience. With that being said, I've only been a couple times, so maybe familiarity will build over time, but it's not civilized though it may be, it's not my home.
Although Cologne, I spent quite a lot of time in Germany. Cologne's very different from Berlin. Had you gone to Berlin, I think your experience might have been quite different, or even Leipzig or Munich or Frankfurt.
Sure. I've been to Berlin, and it's an interesting and cool place. I don't have quite the same emotional connections to it or reactions to it, but no, I would have to probably spend a lot more time in Germany to make more definitive statements in this regard.
The other thing, of course, going on, in addition to the rise of right-wing populism in the United States and across Europe, is the Gaza situation in Israel. You go in acknowledging this. Your dead relative was a man of the left, not Zionist, and probably indifferent or perhaps even hostile to the Zionist project. I get again the sense, John, and you touch on this, that you went in as a progressive Jew, rather indifferent to Zionism. You come out with a slightly different take, particularly given everything that's happening in Israel and Gaza. Tell me how this trip and this experience and this piece changed your view of Zionism and Israel.
It didn't. I've always, it basically remains ambivalent and complicated. I acknowledge, my grandfather and his family went to Palestine, as it was called at the time. My grandfather was in Haganah. I acknowledge that the Zionist project kind of gave them a place of refuge. I am extremely hostile to nationalisms of all sort, insofar as I can be. I have an enormous amount of sympathy with the suffering of the Palestinian people. I do not particularly, I neither wave Israeli or Palestinian flags. I find, basically nationalisms to be analogs or in a lot of ways that are disturbing. You have a religiously inflected nationalism of an oppressed people. Well, what does that sound like? That to me has had a result that's been, nothing but trouble. And I don't believe if the other side had been victorious or is victorious now, would escape the same trap. So I hope there's some way out of both. But I am not predisposed to nationalism. That being said, my sincere hope is that both of those peoples can find some way to live together in peace. Right now, that doesn't look extremely hopeful. I recognize that they both associate emotionally and historically with the nations that they now exist or hope to exist in that area, and there's no erasing them according to my wishes. But I'm an American. I'm not an Israeli, and I'm not a Palestinian, and I have issues with the nationalisms of both, and I am dismayed as a Jewish person with the frankly fascist nature of the regime now in place in Israel, and it breaks my heart, coming from a family that suffered from fascist regimes and suffered from extreme nationalisms, to see my own people turn to that ideology.
That's a strong word, fascist, John. Finally, you, as I said, you just wrote a book, When the Clock Broke, about when con men, conspiracists changed America in the early 1990s, men like David Duke. Are you suggesting that there isn't a great deal of difference between David Duke and Benjamin Netanyahu?
I don't think there's a great deal of difference between David Duke and Itamar Ben-Gvir or Bezalel Smotrich. I think that also the ideological heritage of the Likud party, revisionist Zionism, in the 1930s, recognized its own kinship with European fascism and was willing at times to cooperate with it. I mean, obviously the story is a little more complicated than that, but I don't believe that the type of nationalism that is represented by the ruling parties of Israel right now is in the best traditions of either the Jewish people or the European Enlightenment, which the state of Israel still claims that has some kind of successor or heir to. So I'm comfortable saying that, yes, I think that the tendency in Israel today, although it's not the only one and it's not completely dominant in the society, and I don't want to simplify Israeli society because I know it's a complicated place. And I have a great deal of sympathy for those within Israeli society who are resisting this. But my sense is that, yes, it is moving in a fascist direction.
Can I step on the scene? I'm ready to attack. Andrew Keane. Yeah, he's the one to bash. Asking questions, no filter, just keeps on grinning. He's the man who's got the whole crowd spinning. Money, fame, success, it's all in his sight. He'll dig deep, expose you with all his might. No sugarcoating expert.